As we continue looking at the pragmatics of American Sign Language, we notice that American Sign Language is not uniform. There's a great deal of variation depending on a lot of factors. One of the most important factors in variation for any language is the variation of register. Register has to do with formality. We find in ASL that formal signs and informal signs have different characteristics. In general, formal signs are often two-handed signs, if there's an option between a two-handed and a one-handed variety. Generally, with formal signing, there's less assimilation and clearer eyebrow movement to mark sentence types. On the other hand, there are fewer mouth morphemes that are used. So if there's an option of using a mouth morpheme to modify a verb, as opposed to just simply signing the adverb, in formal signing you'll often sign the adverb rather than use the mouth morpheme. Fingerspelling is typically slower, so there's generally more traditional fingerspelling in formal signing rather than the faster lexicalized and nonsense forms. As mentioned in an earlier discussion, often in formal signing there's more English syntax and more mouthing of English words. In informal settings, on the other hand, we're going to see the opposite of all of these characteristics. We also notice that over time, sign language has changed. Some characteristics that we found in the changing of signs are that signs tend to move away from the center of the face. Signs like C, which used to be made over the two eyes, have moved to the side of the face. Think has likewise moved from the center of the forehead to the side of the forehead. Also, signs that are made on the face and the head tend to move down toward the shoulders and toward the neck area. This is why in younger signers we see the sign think, not signed so much by the temple, but often by the top of the cheek. On the other hand, signs that are made on the body tend to move upward toward the center of the chest. So, if we look at video from 100 years ago, we notice that signs like tired and hungry were made over the stomach, but over time they moved up to the center of the chest. Signs that are made with two hands, if they're made up high, tend to become one-handed signs. On the other hand, signs that are in neutral space, if they're made with one hand, tend to become two-handed signs. So, for instance, we have the sign for to travel around, which is made almost like the sign tornado with two fingers swirling around one another. That sign used to be made with one hand, but over time it's come to be made with two. Similarly, the sign play, which is made in neutral space, used to be made with one hand. Now it's generally made with two. We also notice that there's variation by group. In the South, we see that many signers use older forms. This is particularly true of Black Deaf ASL, where we often find the most original forms of American Sign Language. Because deaf schools were segregated up until the 60s and sometimes even the 70s in the South, we have lots of preservation of original forms in Black Deaf users. Nowadays, so many deaf people attend Gallaudet University that Gallaudet has begun to have its own form of sign language, with particular signs and expressions being common in Gallaudet and not being common in the rest of the world and the rest of the country. On the other hand, because so many people leave Gallaudet and then go out to teach and work in various parts of the U.S., what's common now in Gallaudet often becomes popular throughout the nation within 10 or 15 years, as the signs that are developed there spread. Finally, we notice that ASL varies depending on how it's being used. There are certain types of literature in American Sign Language that create some flexibility in the morphological and syntactic way that ASL is formed. For instance, ASL stories have their own rules about how classifiers might be used. There are examples of ABC stories that just use the alphabet, and number stories, which sometimes play on the forms of signs to conform to the number 1, 2, 3, and 4. There are categories of ASL jokes and ASL poetry, which likewise exhibit the unique flexibility of ASL. At the same time, they also exhibit how ASL is just like any other language. If we look at ASL poetry, for instance, we see the concepts of rhyme with repeated hand shapes or repeated motions, and rhythm with repeated cadence and repeated hold movement structures, just as we see repeated syllables and sounds in spoken language. So, The flexibility of ASL and the variation that we see in ASL based on historical changes, based on group dynamics, and based on the literature of ASL are just like those variations that we see in spoken languages.